Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Braden Banglin, and I'm a senior studying political science and data science here at KU. Having been involved with the Dole Institute and its student advisory board since my freshman year, I've had the amazing experience and have gained much knowledge about complex political issues, bipartisanship, and how to work and advocate for issues one cares about here at the Institute. In addition, I'm very proud to serve as the Institute's discussion group coordinator for my second year in this position, this school year. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs, networking with our special guests, and professional development opportunities. If you are a student and would like to join the Student Advisory Board, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker such as myself after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting the same YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you do have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have any questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program has concluded, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. Also, if you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your question with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Braden, for that warm introduction. Great job. Braden and students like him are the lifeblood of the Dole Institute. Braden works with his colleagues, Ella Rooms and Jacob McCarty, on the discussion group series and facilitating those this semester, and we're so excited to welcome you all for this, actually the second discussion group series that we're hosting this fall. Jonathan Shorman has been a friend of ours for some time. He's been a guest frequently at our Pizza and Politics session, so the student in the audience will recognize him, and we're so pleased that he's with us to be a Dole Fellow this fall and bringing guests with us this rest of the season. So today is our very first session. It's 40 days until Election Day, not too much longer, but Jonathan is going to take us beyond the ballot and help us understand the 2024 elections. Thank you, Jonathan. We really help us understand. Before I turn it over to Jonathan and his guests, I want to be sure and mention that next week, Fort Leavenworth series will be on Wednesday, October 2nd. That will feature a lecture from Dr. Sean Kalick, from the Leavenworth Command General Staff College on the leadership of Russian President Vladimir Putin. You won't want to miss that. And then come back on Thursday, October 3rd at 7 o'clock, where we will welcome our visiting fellow Jerry Seib back to the Dole Institute. He will be interviewing former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, and they'll be discussing the presidential candidates and their views on America's role in the world. So that will be a fascinating conversation, and one that I know we will all appreciate to get more educated on. After this session, Jonathan will be back in a couple of other, three more installments, but mark your calendars and plan to join us on October 9th at 4 p.m. When Jonathan will be joined by political science scholar from Friends University, Russell Fox, and former state legislator Stephanie Sharp for a conversation about ticket splitting voters. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jonathan Shorman. He is the lead political reporter for the Kansas City Star, covering both Kansas and Missouri state governments. Jonathan has spent more than a decade covering politics in both states, including for the Wichita Eagle, where he was part of a team of reporters who received the 2019 George Polk Award for political reporting. Jonathan earned his degree in journalism from the William Allen White School of Journalism here at the University of Kansas. It's a pleasure to turn the floor over to him. He'll introduce his guest this afternoon. Enjoy the conversation, and thanks for being with us. Jonathan?
Great. Well, thanks, Audrey, and thank you to the Dole Institute for having me, and for all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm really happy to have Dr. Alex Middlewood from Wichita State University and Daniel DeRochers, my colleague from the Star, here with us for our discussion. Alex is the Political Science Department Chair at Wichita State. Her areas of expertise include public opinion, political behavior, gun politics, and gender. She's also a contributing columnist for Insight Kansas, that group of columnists, as well as a policy fellow at the Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Fort State University, and also contributes to their annual Kansas Speaks survey as well. Some of you might be familiar with that. She is a KU alum, having earned her PhD here at KU in 2019, and also is a friend of the Dole Institute, having done multiple programs in the past, including a program last spring. Daniel is the Star's Washington correspondent based out of DC. He covers Congress, the White House, and federal courts with a focus on policy and politics important to Kansas and Missouri. He previously covered politics and government for the Lexington Herald-Leader and the Charleston Gazette-Mail. And I'll just say, as a colleague of Daniel, we're very happy to have him on board at the Star. The number of regional political reporters in Washington continues to shrink, so we're lucky to have him. So, Kansas elections this fall. Let's get into it. We have in Kansas, obviously, 4 congressional districts. I think in terms of this conversation, we're going to talk about some of the congressional races first, and then toward the end, speak about state legislative races, and then obviously turn it over with plenty of time for your questions. You know, in recent years, the 3rd congressional district in Kansas, which is currently comprised as the southern Wyandotte County, all of Johnson County, and then this kind of reverse L into rural areas that are southeast of Lawrence, has been thought of as one of the most, the most competitive district in Kansas, with currently Democrat Sharice Davids holding that seat since 2018. She's running again for re-election this fall. But at the same time, in every election since she first got into Congress in 2018, her margin of victory has increased. So is the 3rd district still the most competitive district in Kansas? Daniel?
I think by the raw numbers, yes. We're going to see what happens this time around. I do think that this is kind of one of those elections that could, I guess, set the tone for whether or not Sharice Davids can kind of stay in office for as long as she kind of continues to run. I talked to a former moderate Republican, or a current moderate Republican source, who, her take on it was basically that so long as Trump is at the top of the ticket, Sharice Davids isn't really going anywhere, that the voters, particularly the moderate Republican voters of Johnson County, don't really like what's going on in terms of where Trump is leading the Republican Party, and so they kind of see Davids as a balance to that. And it's this idea that, you know, it's a suburban district, it's a pretty educated district, it's the type of district that over the past few years has moved towards the Democratic Party, and in 2020 moved toward President Joe Biden. And so long as, I don't want to call it Trumpism, but as long as you know, former President Trump's politics kind of dominate the Republican Party, it isn't likely to kind of shift back anytime soon. Yeah.
Yeah, and she really is impacted by a changing demographic in Johnson County, to her favor in this case, where Johnson County residents are getting younger, they're getting more college educated, and those demographics have been trending to the left politically, nationally, and Johnson County is certainly no different. We've seen even this election cycle that college-educated white voters are moving towards the Democratic Party, and that's going to really benefit her in that district, too.
You know, a couple of years ago when redistricting occurred, there were predictions, because her district was redrawn to include more rural areas south of the KC Metro. There were predictions that that change, if you will, would potentially impact her ability to, if not win, at least the margin of her victory. That doesn't seem to be the case. Why didn't that really have an effect, Do we have a sense of that?
I mean, theoretically, it should have. They split Wyandotte County in half. They pulled in some of those rural districts, should have made it more competitive for a Republican. And we know that she won by 12 points in 2022 versus 10 in 2020. And so part of it, is that changing demographic we talked about in Johnson County, but she's also done a really good job of pitching herself to those rural voters into getting some more support in those counties than anyone, I think, would have expected.
Yeah, and if you talk to some Republicans, they would say it was a candidate problem in some ways. The Republicans ran the same candidate twice in a row. There were questions about how much she was really pushing. When you look at the 3rd Congressional District, there's only so many districts that are considered competitive across the country. It's like a handful. It's really, really small of the 435. And so those people get targeted as, on the Democratic side, they get called frontliners. On the Republican side, they get called young guns. And this district has always been one of those races where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party say that these are the people we want to defend or protect or flip, et cetera, et cetera. I think that, you can tell how honest they are about that based on how much the national parties are pumping money into the race come October, come November. And in 2022, the national parties weren't pumping money into that race in October. They had basically said, send your money here, support this guy, but they were focused on other tighter districts where they really had a chance of flipping seats. This time around, you're starting to see that pattern again. When you're looking at where the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is the Republican majority's campaign arm, they aren't running ads so much in Kansas. They're focused on other districts in New York and California, which are really going to kind of determine the majority. And because the House of Representatives really is the most up for grabs in some ways this November. And so I say all of that to kind of preface, to get back to what you were saying, is that, yes, the district demographically didn't necessarily look like it favored Sharice Davids, but she's doing a lot of things to kind of endear herself to the district. She's, where so much of the Washington attention economy is, particularly in the House, is built on attention. You can probably name some of the biggest firebrands on both the Democratic side and the Republican side in Congress because they're really good at drawing attention to themselves. That helps them raise money. It helps them in this, era of Congress, get status that helps legislation move, that sort of thing. And Sharice Davids has really rejected that model, and she's been trying to keep her head down, at all costs, to the point where, when Democrats were concerned about whether or not President Biden should run again, she was waiting in the back. She was not one of those kind of frontline Democrats who were trying to push him aside for Vice President Harris. I think that plays in her favor, and then she's also done a good job of trying to court the agricultural vote. So she, instantly after they added some of the more rural counties to the district, she joined the House Agriculture Committee, and so now she's working on the Farm Bill. And that sort of thing helped her get the endorsement of the Kansas Farm Bureau, which helps her lock up votes. And so she's doing a lot of the kind of old school politicking in a way that is kind of helping keep her hold on that district.
So her opponent, Republican opponent, is Dr. Prasanth Reddy of Johnson County. And this is for both or either of you. How is he different or that's similar to her previous opponents, Amanda Atkins and Kevin Yoder, who she defeated, the incumbent congressman? What does he offer that's maybe different than what we've seen from the Republican candidates who have unsuccessfully tried to defeat her previously?
Yeah, you can.
The biggest difference really is that, especially Amanda Atkins, was a political insider. She had chaired the Kansas Republican Party. She had worked for a member of Congress, whereas Reddy really is a political outsider. He doesn't have political experience, and he's pushing that message to voters as not only a way to be different from Sharice Davids at this point, but to be different from these previous candidates who have also run in this race. And that really seems to be what he's leaning into. On issues, it's pretty similar. There are a few key differences, but that political outsider versus insider really seems to be the key difference this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think he also has a pretty compelling story. He was an immigrant, he was a cancer doctor, he's, given back to the community. When you watch all the things about his biography, it really does tell a kind of American story. The other thing that I found really interesting in the primary is that, oftentimes candidates get pulled to the polls of their party in a primary. They get kind of forced to take positions that they might not otherwise take, that sort of thing. Reddy was running against a relatively moderate candidate. They were both kind of what I would consider, old school Republicans at this point. And they didn't have to kind of get out on a limb, or he didn't have to get out on a limb and take some of the more controversial stances that might have appealed to a Republican primary electorate that didn't appeal to a general election electorate, because they're two very different electorates. And I think that benefits him moving forward. I think that he just has a lot of kind of, I guess, institutional disadvantages to overcome when it comes to this district. And, the incumbency advantage is real. And she does have now a couple terms under her belt, which kind of helps solidify her stance or her standing in the district.
Alex, do we have any kind of substantial polling on that district?
No, unfortunately. We don't have a lot of polling pretty much on any of the congressional districts in Kansas. There was a couple from earlier this year before the primary. We don't have any polling data, and we may not ever get any at this point in the race, which is disappointing if you're a public opinion nerd like I am. We don't really have any polling. So really the only thing we can do is kind of look at, primary turnout and her previous year turnout, and make some educated guesses, but we don't have those polls, unfortunately.
Is there, we've spoken about how Reddy is both similar and dissimilar to previous Republican candidates. Has Davids herself changed her messaging over time? How does her campaign this time look different or is the same from what we saw in 2022 and 2020?
I find it looks really similar. She kind of has the same kind of, I'm moderate, I support bipartisanship, like that messaging. She's used that every campaign, at least that I've covered her. The Republicans repeatedly try to kind of carve into that because Congress isn't necessarily that bipartisan of a place at this point. And so you end up taking votes either for or against things. I wrote a story a few months back about messaging bills because so much of Congress in an election year is messaging bills. It's these bills, both parties do this. The Democrats put them up in the Senate, the Republicans put it up in the House, that are really there to advance a political message more so than to actually get any type of legislation passed. The ones that pass the House are going to die in the Senate. The ones that pass the Senate, actually, they just fail in the Senate because you have the filibuster. And so, she gets forced to take votes that she probably wouldn't really want to be taking that could cut into that moderate image. But then she kind of uses the institutions of the office to really stress that bipartisanship. There's a thing called franking privileges that members of Congress have where they get to send out mail on the taxpayer dime as long as it has to do with official business. She uses that to send out surveys about like, don't you love bipartisanship? We should have more bipartisanship in Congress, right? Or like things like, oh, I helped lower the cost of insulin, which, she voted for the bill that helped cap insulin prices for seniors. And so the more that she can stress those really, really popular, everybody likes ideas, she does. And so I think that really is her message every time that she runs for re-election is she has this resume that like she was an MMA fighter and she's really unique, and then you meet her in person and she's like very mild-mannered is the way I might put it. It's interesting.
Yeah, I would also add, you mentioned that she joined the House Agriculture Committee as soon as they changed her district. She's done a lot of messaging around that as she's there to listen, to learn, because she didn't know a lot about it. And it seems like that she's really doing that, and that's working because she got that big endorsement from the Kansas Farm Bureau. And voters want to be listened to, right? They want to be heard. And so it seems like she's doing that, at least with the Agriculture Committee.
Then one last question on the third before we move on. It does seem an open question whether Republicans or Democrats will take control of the House. At least it certainly seems a little bit more difficult over in the Senate. But assuming Democrats take the House and assuming Sharice Davids wins re-election, what does that mean? This is her would be her fourth term. What does that mean for her, both her seniority and the kind of influence that she would have in the Democratic caucus, for either of you?
I mean, so she's slowly working her way up the ladder, kind of the way it used to work. She, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if I'm supposed to say that yet, but she's paying attention to different leadership roles, and so like there not only are there leadership roles on committees, but there's also caucuses, and so I think that she's trying to figure out her path on which caucuses she might want to help lead in the new term if Democrats are in power. And then, yeah, you just kind of have to work yourself up through the committees. She's on small business, she's on transportation, she's on agriculture. So she's on a bunch of committees where she's been basically her whole term, and she's slowly moving up that ladder and gaining seniority. And traditionally in Congress, seniority means a lot. It means, being able to get projects funded. And, Sam Graves is, on the Missouri side, he's the chairman now of the Transportation Committee, and he's been able to fund, he's an aviation nerd, he's been able to fund all sorts of aviation projects for private pilots that he really likes, and that's just sort of one of those things that comes along with the power. And so she's taking definitely more of a Graves approach than a kind of rabble-rouser approach.
Yeah, a lot has changed in politics in the last couple of decades. That's probably an understatement. But it's very traditional, like pork barrel politics. You get to bring home benefits to your district and to your state. The higher up you are in leadership, she'll have the benefit to be able to do that even more, which she can then run on in future elections, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. The second district, which is essentially the rest of eastern Kansas that's not in the first, or the third district, excuse me. As recently as 2018, that district had a highly competitive general election race. Now it certainly seems like it's an advantage to Republicans in that district. Alex, why is the second district not the third district? Why do Republicans have the advantage in the second, or seem to have the advantage?
I mean, the easiest answer is that they got rid of Lawrence. They put Lawrence in the big first, which takes away that huge voting base for Democrats in the second congressional district, drowns out those voters into the first, and makes that second congressional district even more solidly Republican than it would have been had they not done that. And that's really the biggest advantage for Republicans. They've also held the seat, even though LaTurner is not running for re-election. He can, endorse whoever he wants. And Derek Schmidt is a really popular name. People in Kansas know him. And so that works to their advantage as well.
Right. Do we know about, you mentioned Derek Schmidt, the Republican nominee, former Kansas Attorney General, ran for governor a couple of years ago unsuccessfully against Laura Kelly. What do we know? Do we know how he did in the second district in the governor's race? Did he win that district?
I did not look up those numbers. Okay. My gut would say, yeah, he probably did.
Sure. He was in his Republican primary race against, he was facing Jeff Kahrs, who was a former LaTurner staffer, had previously worked, I believe, with HHS during the Trump administration, if I'm not mistaken. What Republican voters selecting Derek Schmidt over Jeff Kahrs, what can we learn from that in terms of kind of where Republican voters are at in that district, what they're looking for?
I don't know how much you can infer about, I mean, there's some things you can infer about where Republican voters are at, but it's also like the strength of kind of traditional name recognition politics, right? Like Derek Schmidt was fresh off of a gubernatorial campaign. He'd been attorney general for a long time. Like people knew who he was, and that goes a long way, particularly in primaries. The people he was running against, Sean Tiffany, Jeff Kahrs, they just weren't as well known as Derek Schmidt was. And he really used that name recognition to his advantage to kind of just lock the kind of momentum behind him in that primary. I think what you're asking, and I think that there's some truth to this, is, he was, both Cars and Tiffany were running to Schmidt's right. They were basically saying, yeah, he's a conservative, but he's not as conservative as you want. You want, a true conservative. And the fact that the voters didn't kind of buy into that, I think does say that when you look at the Republican seats, the Republican-held seats in Kansas, that one is probably a little bit more, I keep using this word traditional. It's because I think that we're in the midst of a realignment in the Republican Party. So forgive me for that use. I'm still kind of figuring out the language that I'm trying to use there. But it is one of the more kind of traditional Republican seats in Kansas. You saw the Turner vote for pieces of legislation that Estes and Mann have not voted for, particularly like when it came to making sure that the government stayed open, or some of those other pieces of legislation where Democrats have had to come in and help out the Republicans in order to keep things running. And that puts him more in a kind of traditional role in Congress.
Although he was on House oversight, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. He was. Yeah.
So that put him in some of the investigations.
Yeah, but he was kind of mild-mannered in all those things. Like he wasn't Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever, right? And so I think what he's alluding to is, and so Turner actually had a kind of smart strategy there. He was in the Appropriations Committee, which, pork barrel politics, that's getting money back to the district. And then he was on the Oversight Committee. And then in this new kind of attention Congress, that's the committee that gets us all the attention. So he was able to have his foot in kind of both of those pools of like, hey, look, I'm helping the district, while also saying, but I'm also part of this Hunter Biden investigation and looking into that sort of stuff. He was trying to navigate that kind of space where the Republican Party is in this moment, and he was doing it relatively successfully before he decided he was going to step down. I mean, he still got criticized by the Kansas Republican Party for some of his votes, but he was mostly kind of riding that line pretty successfully.
On the Democratic side, we have former Congresswoman Nancy Boyda, who's actually back as the Democratic nominee. She, might remember, in the 2000s defeated Jim Ryan, the Republican. She faced Matt Kleinman, kind of a Wyandotte County community activist, if that's the right way to phrase it, in the Democratic primary. Kind of same question, what can we take away from her winning that primary in terms of kind of candidate, the kind of issues that Democrats in the district are focused on? Is it just a matter of Boyda had that name recognition with Democrats in the area? Is it something else? Do you have an idea, Alex?
I mean, she really took a leaf out of Laura Kelly's book, where she pitched herself as the centrist candidate, often taking stances to the right of the Democratic Party, especially nationally, to prove that, especially on things like border security, transgender athletes, et cetera. And that was a smart move, because Laura Kelly is popular in Kansas. She's the most popular political figure. We have some polling on this from 2023, the Kansas Speak survey, which is run out of the Docking Institute at Fort Hays State. It showed that her approval rating, which was only at 38%, but was over 15 points higher than the next closest. And so in that survey, we ask about other statewide candidates. We ask about state and federal institutions like the legislature and President Biden, and she was over 15 points higher than any of those. And so by kind of putting herself alongside Laura Kelly, she's taking that same kind of center of the road stance. Whenever I talk about this, I think about the ad that Laura Kelly had in 2020 of her literally walking down the middle of a road. That's pretty much what Nancy Boyda did in that primary, and it shows that at least spoke to those voters in the second.
Are we seeing, does she talk much in her campaign about her previous service in Congress? Does that feature a lot?
Yeah, a little bit. And to the other point, like name recognition also probably helped. Name recognition is important. And you never know how much it takes to get until you don't have it. She talks about it a little. I mean, I do think that her real emphasis is on this type of, I'm going to be the middle of the road candidate. I'm going to make Democrats angry. I'm going to make Republicans angry. But at the end of the day, we need more people who are willing to have tough discussions. At least that's been her kind of emphasis when I've interviewed her. It's hitting that sort of thing hard.
I want to talk about the first district because we are in the first district. Just a massive geography, spans from here all the way out to the Colorado border. I think most people would agree that the first district is thought of as a solidly Republican district, and it is based on election results. So I guess the question I want to ask is, now that Lawrence is in this district and will be for the next decade, perhaps even beyond that, is there actually a path for Democrats to become competitive in the first, and what would that look like?
So this is a little controversial, but I think yes. So for the past 2 years, I've been telling my students that the Republican Party made a mistake by gerrymandering Lawrence into the big first. Do I think that it's going to flip the first altogether? Probably not. Is it going to make it competitive? Sure. Not this year, not 2 years from now, but maybe 8 years down the road it could. We're seeing, those major demographic shifts in Southwest Kansas for the past 40 years. And as children of immigrants become voting age, it could make that district more competitive. We know that there are several counties in Southwest Kansas that have very large Hispanic populations. Latino voters are increasingly trending towards the Democratic Party, but young voters are as well. And then Lawrence is also growing in population every year, which certainly doesn't help, or doesn't hurt either.
Yeah, I agree that it's going to take a little bit. And I think that, I mentioned the realignment earlier, and I think that as we look at political realignment, that's also a big factor here, right? Kansas, not so much, but for a really long time, you had a lot of rural voters who were voting for the Democratic Party, and they really have shifted just since probably a little before 2016, but 2016 seemed to be like a really big moment in that shift. And the more that rural voters continue to lean toward the Republican Party, the harder it is for, Democrats haven't really figured out how to, I guess, cut their losses in rural districts as much as they need to be competitive statewide in states like Kansas and Missouri at the federal level. Obviously, at the gubernatorial level, it's been different. I think that those politics are really different, and that's partially why. But, they've really struggled at the federal level.
Right. At least theoretically, all these districts are supposed to have roughly the same population. But I am curious, given just the geography of the first, is it logistically difficult to actually be the congressperson for a district this large? What does that look like on a practical level? I don't know if either of you have insight into that. But it's just I'm curious.
I would never want to be a congressman, period, let alone
Yeah,
a congressman
same.
from that district. That's really tough. You got to be traveling, and you weigh the very different interests of Lawrence and Garden City. They're not looking at the same issues. You have different values, different everything. And it's one of the things that I've always found fascinating and challenging, probably about being a politician, which is, particularly the more that we see this kind of polarization, it gets really, really hard to represent everyone. Often it feels like either you're representing the voters who voted for you and not the ones who voted against you. And that's kind of tough. And no matter what, I think that that's a difficult line that members of Congress are walking right now of, it used to be this thing of I don't know that I can say definitively that it used to be a thing, but, elections are different than governing. And it feels more and more that elections are leaking into the governing part, and that makes balancing all of your constituents' interests more difficult. That said, they'll all still help folks get passports and, with constituent services and that sort of thing.
Yeah, even if we think of agriculture as kind of the biggest issue that could potentially bring all of those counties in the first congressional district together, there's still many types of agriculture because it is so wide and so diverse in, cattle ranching versus farming versus the needs of those different industries. I certainly don't envy any member of Congress representing that district.
Mm-hmm. Has Representative Tracy Mann given any indication about his future? The first district is often thought of as kind of a stepping stone. You look at Pat Roberts, you look at Bob Dole, Roger Marshall.
That would require one of the senators to kind of side. We don't know whether or not that'll happen anytime soon. And so I think it's one of those wait and see moments. I think that, having to represent the big first is a reasonable training ground for having to represent the whole state, because again, you have the same kind of challenges of, suburban Kansas versus rural Kansas. And so we'll see down the road. I don't know how to phrase it. He's not necessarily acting like a politician who is interested in courting the areas that he doesn't represent, if that makes sense. But that could change closer to an election.
And I do want to talk about the 4th District, Alex's backyard. This is, 4th District includes kind of the south central Kansas, that Wichita area, Sedgwick County. So we have Johnson County, which is the most populous county in Kansas, and Sedgwick County is the second most populous. This goes back to my question about the differences between the 3rd District and the 2nd District, but what are kind of the differences between the 4th District and Sedgwick County and Johnson County? How are they different, and how has that kind of driven politics in maybe different directions in those two populated areas?
Yeah, class is really one of the biggest differences there. And we are seeing increasing class divides and party affiliation. So we see college-educated voters are increasingly moving towards the Democrats, and we really see that demographic in Johnson County, whereas in Wichita or Sedgwick County, it's more blue-collar working class, which used to belong mostly to the Democratic Party, but has shifted over the last decade or so towards Republicans. And so we really see that is the major difference between those populations. Sedgwick County has gone blue a couple of times in the last decade or so, but it is increasingly moving towards the Republican Party, and it really is because of that realignment, I think.
This can apply to all of the races really statewide. So this is a presidential election year, obviously. How does that change the makeup of the electorate and the kinds of voters that down ballot candidates at the congressional level, but frankly also probably at the state legislative level, the kind of voters that they're trying to turn out, or the pool of voters that they have available to win over in court? Is that different than a midterm, essentially?
Well,
Yeah, it's definitely different than a midterm. So in a midterm, you get people who typically vote in every election, whereas there's lots of people who only turn out to vote in presidential elections. And when you're running for office, that actually makes it a lot more difficult, because you can't necessarily use the same strategies that you used 2 years ago if you're a member of the House, because you're looking at a totally different population, or at least a mostly different population. The electorate is more diverse by every definition, and there's more voters in presidential years. And so you really have to raise more money, you have to target that better, and you're not just speaking to your base party voters, which candidates do typically in midterm elections.
Yeah, and so 2 points of it. So one on the last one, the Sedgwick County part. You can see that in how Representative Estes is kind of maneuvering Congress of, where there's certainly a branch of the Republican Party that is taking on more populist stances, and they're kind of feeling comfortable with the word populist. They like being called populist. And that sort of, rural working class voter who used to be a Democrat, a lot of those type of populist stances are aimed to appeal to those people. And when you see where Representative Estes is voting, he's often kind of siding with that wing of the Republican Party that views themselves as more populist. So that fits in with that realignment. And then to the presidential race and different voters. I mean, look at the national conversation right now. It's all about undecided voters, which to those people who follow politics, it's kind of like, who doesn't have an opinion by now? But there are people out there that are really struggling, that are on the fence. And those people tend to be what they call low information voters that are harder to reach, that might be picking based on vibes, like, would you get a beer with that person, that sort of thing. And that, I think that is a politician's real struggle of how do you reach those voters, how do you make contact with those voters, and how do you win those voters over? And so I think that particularly in congressional races, you see people really focusing on their base, and that idea of, I don't necessarily want to convince the so-called persuadables, those people who might, might vote one way one election and one way another election, and they focus more on, well, how do I turn out the people who I know are going to vote for me? And they try to increase their ability to target those voters, both with technology and with, advertising and that sort of thing. And the more that they can get out those base voters, the less it downplays the kind of unpredictability of the persuadable voters.
Mm-hmm.
In Kansas, we're kind of on a midterm cycle in terms of our statewide offices where, governor, attorney general, treasurer, secretary of state, we elect them in 4-year terms on the congressional midterm years. I know from covering Missouri's on the opposite schedule where they're on the presidential year, presidential cycle. Somewhat similar, but maybe a different point. How would, if Kansas were on the presidential cycle for these statewide offices, how do you anticipate that would kind of change the kind of campaigning that we would see or the kind of electorate that we would see for those offices?
I mean, I certainly don't think that Laura Kelly would be our governor. We know that she's popular, right? But Donald Trump won Kansas by 14 points in 2020. And so it would be very different. You would also see an increase in what we're calling the nationalization of local elections, which we're already seeing, but it would be even more so, where we see these state level candidates or even local candidates talking about national issues that they really can't do anything about. We're already seeing that, let alone if we were electing those offices at the same time as the president. It would become even more of an issue.
Yeah, it allows somebody like Laura Kelly to really stiff arm the national conversation of like, okay, you want to talk about the thing? I don't. This is what my actual job is. And it gives them a kind of rhetorical out on having to weigh in on so many of those issues. And I think that if you look at the 2022 election, Derek Schmidt was trying to nationalize it, right? Like he kept trying to bring in some of those more polarizing national issues into the race. The issue over transgender rights being probably the most apparent. Kelly was able to maintain distance from that. And, it plays into the whole, she stood in the middle of the road. Like, if you didn't get the theme of her campaign, it was right there. And she can portray herself as more middle of the road when she doesn't have to weigh in on whatever news item of the day that the circus in Washington is wrangling.
Right. So at the state level, without those statewide offices in play this year, kind of the main contest is every single state legislative seat is up for grabs. Although maybe not really up for grabs because a lot of them don't end up with general election opponents. So some of them have already been decided. But I guess, Alex, really it seems like the real key difference this year is whether Democrats are going to prevent Republicans from having a supermajority in one or both houses in the Kansas legislature. What is beyond the obvious answer of it stops Republicans from overriding vetoes or can stop them from overriding vetoes? What is kind of what would be the uptake of Democrats accomplishing that?
Yeah, it's really everything to them in this election. And it also is not just, overriding a governor's veto, as you said, but it's really Republicans' only hope of passing more conservative pieces of legislation that they know that Laura Kelly would veto. And they've also struggled to get moderate Republicans on board for a lot of that. So Dems have really focused on 10-ish races here in Kansas. They only need to flip 3 Senate seats and 2 House seats. And they are dumping a lot of money into those races trying to do that. But it is incredibly important to the Democratic Party to flip those seats so that they have any shot at, trying to block some of this more conservative legislation.
Would we expect, even if Democrats are successful in that, would we expect the Republican caucus itself to become more conservative? So you would have a smaller caucus, but the Republican members that they have would be further to the right than the current caucus?
It's certainly possible, and they would put a lot more effort into whipping their members into line on certain votes. And I think it would help them band together because they know they don't have that supermajority advantage.
You know, this year, Governor Laura Kelly actually formed a PAC that's helping inserting herself into some of these races. Do we have a sense of whether her efforts have been successful or how much money, what the extent of her activity actually is?
Yeah, so she endorsed 4 Democratic candidates in the primary, raised about $1 million going into that primary, was what I could find about it. And all 4 of those Democrats won those primary races, including against some incumbents that had gone against Laura Kelly on some tax bills. And they were pretty decisive victories as well. And so it seems like, I don't really want to use the term kingmaker, but she's used her PAC a little bit to be a kingmaker in the House and Senate by really trying to get those middle-of-the-road candidates who are willing to reach across the aisle and work with those moderate Republicans. The PAC has even come out and said that they're not opposed to endorsing moderate Republicans. I don't think they have done that to this point, but it's certainly something we could see going into the general. And she's also it's not the only moderate focused PAC either. There was another one that was formed this year called Kansans First. And so it definitely seems to be a theme in this election.
Is that unusual for a governor to do that in Kansas? Is that a new activity, or we've seen this in the past?
In the last several years, at least, it's certainly new and different. I couldn't tell you exactly with other states and how that compares. But any governor, especially going against an incumbent of their own party, is certainly out of the ordinary.
Right. And then my last question before we go to audience questions is we mentioned kind of moderates here, and I think it used to be a bit of a truism or a saying in Kansas politics that there's kind of 3 parties. There's conservative Republicans, moderate Republicans, and Democrats in Kansas. It doesn't feel like we hear that as much anymore. Are moderate Republicans still a significant factor in our state level politics here, or have we essentially been kind of cleaved into 2, and more conservative Republicans at this point, and maybe a larger Democratic Party than in the past?
They certainly still exist, though they are definitely a dying breed. And we really saw that a couple of years ago when we saw several Republican women switch to the Democratic Party, and they're few and far between nowadays in Kansas politics.
Yeah, I'll mention the discussion group students were great at pulling this data, and this is just for Johnson County over 2012 to 2024 party affiliation. Democrats in 2012, about 23%. In 2024, of August of this year, 32.4% in Johnson County. Republicans were 46.4% in 2012. This year in Johnson County, they're 41%. And then kind of independents also, actually the number of independents or the percentage of independents declining a little bit. So that's just Johnson County. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the statewide number is, but I think that certainly speaks to this idea that it seems like Democrats are kind of picking up folks that used to think of themselves as Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a ton of truth to that, right? And so it goes back to like, how are we seeing and how are things shifting? And it seems to be that like there are a group of Republicans who they don't recognize necessarily the party that they once were proud members of, and they don't really want to join the Democratic Party because there's a bunch of values that they don't necessarily agree with. And so they feel like they're in this kind of no man's land. And we're seeing this kind of nationally where these people don't feel like they necessarily have a home. But if you take Kansas, right, and you take just the Senate delegation from Kansas, and you have Roger Marshall on one hand, and you have Jerry Moran on one hand. Jerry Moran, arguably, he served in Congress for a really long time. He might be, in theory, heading out, at some point. Roger Marshall, who, he's still in his first term. Moran has not endorsed in the presidential race. Marshall is enthusiastically endorsing Donald Trump. You look at how Moran is kind of working in Congress. He focuses a lot on things that are generally bipartisan, like veterans issues or that sort of thing. Roger Marshall's more willing to kind of be a bomb thrower and, you know, go on Fox News and talk about the kind of more polarizing cultural issues, where Jerry Moran really doesn't like engaging in that stuff. And then the really big one that I noticed is the wars overseas, particularly the war in Ukraine. Jerry Moran was part of that group that wanted to find some way to fund the war in Ukraine. He was generally supportive of the bipartisan border deal, but eventually voted with his party against that bill. And Marshall was part of the group of Republicans who was really trying to tear down that bipartisan border bill from the beginning. And so in a lot of ways, if we're looking at where the Republican Party seems to be headed, we have to look more at Roger Marshall than Jerry Moran, even though I do think that there is a big contingent in Washington and elsewhere of, you know, people who are craving what the party used to be. You could call them Nikki Haley voters, right? All those people in the primaries who voted for Nikki Haley, they're wishing that it was something that it probably isn't.
I know I promised, I'm just going to use my moderator's prerogative and ask one more question, which is that, you know, if former President Donald Trump at some point in the future is no longer on the political scene, have Republicans lost those kind of moderate voters forever? Or is this kind of a temporary thing driven by the Trump atmosphere that we're in?
Well, there are people in Washington who say, oh, as soon as Trump's gone, you know, it's going to go back to the old Republican Party. I don't believe that. You know, I think that it's really structurally changed. And I think that, you know, eventually, you know, whether it's, you know, 4 years from now, whenever, you know, Trump as the kind of attention vacuum thing that he is, he's not necessarily going to be in the forefront in the same way. And the Republican Party will have to figure out, you know, well, what does the party stand for in the aftermath of that? And I think that the evidence shows that going back to what the party was maybe in the George H.W. Bush era isn't likely. And if you talk to folks like Senator Josh Hawley, who I talk to a lot, he says, you know, he wants that old version of the Republican Party to be over and done with. He wants it to be a different, more populist party that he says is the party of the working class voter, and not necessarily the party that, you know, we used to think of them as Chamber of Commerce Republicans in the past.
And that's where a lot of Republican voters are today, too, which is going to really make the Republican Party kind of have this reckoning and have to figure out where they're going in the future. And there certainly will not be a consensus.
Well, happy to take audience questions. I think Ella, Braden, and Jacob are around with microphones. So if you have a question, don't be shy. Yes, sir. The stripe. Well, wait for the. Thank you.
First, I just have a comment about Mr. Mann. I went to his town hall, and he is just a jerk. And in terms of attracting people in Lawrence, I went to his town hall. He just trashed the people in Lawrence. So I don't think he can expect to get any votes in Lawrence if he decides to run for the Senate. But my real question is, you know, last session, the Kansas legislature kind of focused on financial issues and also on the transgender stuff, which I think is stupid. But I guess what are they going to focus on, say, 2025?
Alex, you might be.
So they are certainly going to focus a lot on those economic issues, those tax issues again. I think that we can expect to see some more reproductive rights bills come out of the state legislature, certainly. And there's probably going to be more of the kind of same old, lots of bills that get introduced to make a splash and don't go anywhere. I think depending on how this presidential election goes, we will possibly see more voting laws, again, try to make their way through the state legislature. I think a lot really rides on the election results in November before we actually know a definitive answer to that.
I think you'll see a lot of attention paid to property taxes and a big push to have some kind of reform centered around property taxation. I don't know what that'll be, but who else? How about you, ma'am?
Thank you so much for joining us today. I had earlier on in your discussion, you spoke about the Frank surveys that Rep. David sends out. I had the opportunity to work for her this past spring, and we send them out one per quarter. And it's sort of a new trend in the new Dems coalition. And I was wondering, from your perspective, is that an effective way of political communication, since it is a bit more traditional versus more social media? And then my other part of the question is that some issues we focused on are, of course, bipartisanship and grocery prices and border issues. Is there another issue that you think would, I guess, form a larger coalition of voters for her in the 3rd District?
So on the Frankie stuff, so yes, the mail is one part of it. They also now they get approved for email stuff, and so like, you know, the emails that you might get on the phone or text messages, that sort of thing is another aspect of that. My answer to that is it probably doesn't hurt, right? And Johnson County is a unique county in which franking privileges probably, or Johnson County, but I'm using Johnson County because that's where the majority of voters in the 3rd District are, but it's a unique county in which that sort of thing helps, because you can't target that mailing because of the official nature of it the way that you can target campaign material. But in Johnson County, you have pretty much, you know, you have more Republicans than you have Democrats, and so your targeting doesn't necessarily matter as much because you're just trying to reach as many people as possible, particularly with messages about bipartisanship and that sort of thing. I think that, you know, yes, there are other issues that one could focus on, but, you know, you end up highlighting certain ones as the kind of biggest vote motivators, and particularly in 2022, and it's going to be back this time around, reproductive rights, abortion rights. That was the big thing for her campaign to emphasize. And, you know, they're still emphasizing it. I mean, the Kansas Democratic Party the other day came out and was criticizing Prashanth Reddy for not denouncing a post by the Johnson County Republican Party that took a more extreme stance on abortion than Prashanth Reddy has taken. You know, it's one of those issues that really has seemed to motivate Democratic voters and motivate voters in the past few years since the Dobbs decision came down, and you're just going to continue to see kind of those frontline Democrats lean on that because it's one of their strongest issues heading into an election.
Yeah.
You want to say anything?
I was just going to say that abortion is a winning issue for Democrats. In every single state that we've seen some sort of abortion amendment on the ballot, it has, you know, sided to protect abortion, even in more conservative states. And we're also seeing some Republicans change their messaging about it too. And so we see nationally a lot of Democrats are leaning into that issue because it's a winning issue for them.
Ma'am, here in the front. Dr. Graham.
Hi, I'm in the Lawrence bubble, I guess you call it, and so I want to ask a question about demographics, because speaking specifically from students who come to the University of Kansas and who are the children of immigrants, and I'm not talking about, I want to go beyond the Hispanic Latinx population, so I'm curious about, you know, who's coming in, who's leaving, and what the impact of that demographic shift beyond the one you mentioned. I don't think I heard as much about other populations who are coming and or going. So I'm curious about the impact of that.
Yeah, so the biggest shift or biggest trend that we're seeing right now is that young people, even regardless of race and regardless of education status too, so regardless of whether they're college educated, are shifting farther and farther to the left. And that is certainly true of specific demographic groups like Black women, for example, especially college-educated Black women. And so we're seeing that it's really more of even an age issue than it is a race issue when it comes to that trend of moving to the left. We actually see in national polls that Donald Trump has increased his support among Latino and Black voters now since 2020. But it's really that age factor that's making a huge difference, and then gender as well.
Yeah, on the gender front, there seems to be something going on, particularly among men masculinity, and moving toward the Republican Party. You know, there's a couple of surveys, and it's not necessarily as neat. It's like looking at younger voters, and it's not necessarily as neat as like women support Democrats, men support Republicans, but it has to do with how one views the genders. And if you view kind of strict gender roles, you're going to be more inclined to support the Republican Party at this stage. And so you see it in the Trump campaign, the way that they play up this idea of masculinity, of strength, of whatever. And that seems to be a real attempt to kind of appeal to what seems to be more of his base, which is this kind of male voter.
How about you, sir, in the back corner?
This is more on the Missouri side, but how close is the Hawley and Kuntz race?
Both campaigns will tell you that it is really close and it is tightening. And that's based on polling. But if Lucas Kuntz were to win, he would have to get, I think, something like 16 percentage points of people who would be splitting their ticket and voting for Donald Trump and then voting for Lucas Kuntz. And that's a really, really tough thing to do. And he's trying it. He's really trying to emphasize his moderate credentials. He's taken a few stances, particularly on immigration, and talked about, working with the Border Patrol, that sort of thing. But there is a really kind of structural inherent advantage to Republicans in Missouri right now, where in some ways they are probably more Republican than Kansas is, particularly in the statewide races, because they haven't had, they're more of a transitional state than Kansas is at this point. They were kind of really, they were this bellwether for so long, and then now, in the kind of era of Trump, they've stopped being a bellwether and they're solidly conservative, and so their changes are still relatively new in a way that Kansas is a little more settled, and Republicans have held power for so long that I think Kansans are more willing to say, okay, we're going to support a Democratic gubernatorial candidate.
Yeah, and Hawley may get less of the vote this year than he would in past years simply because Missouri has that abortion amendment on the ballot, and we've seen in states across the country that amendment really does mobilize Democratic voters. But I agree that I don't think it's going to swing that election.
How about you, sir, in the far back?
Thank you. Yeah, I want to build on the previous questions because you covered Kansas very well, but there are some interesting elections near us. So you already mentioned the Missouri abortion referendum. I wonder, how do you feel about that and what are its chances of passing? And also the races in Nebraska, also their abortion referendum and their Senate race, which is also tightening and interesting because their candidate is an independent, not a Democrat. And also maybe a little bit on how Nebraska awarded electoral votes, and for now that attempt has been thwarted, but will it change in the near future, in your opinion?
The electoral vote thing was really interesting. That was kind of a fascinating drama. And as you've noted, the one state senator said that he was not going to go for it. I think there's a possibility that changes in the future. Not in an election year, but you don't know, and I think that if it were to change not in an election year, Maine would also change, and so there's a kind of balance there. In the Missouri abortion amendment, the polling that we've seen so far, a majority of people support it. When you're looking at the campaign against it, what we're seeing right now is anti-abortion folks are saying that it's going to go farther than where the rights were before Roe v. Wade. And one of the things that they've been doing rhetorically is some activists tend to tie reproductive rights to the right to control your health care if you're transgender. And so Josh Hawley in particular has been trying to say that the abortion amendment will open the door to mandate gender-affirming care in Missouri. Legal experts say that that's unlikely. The Missouri Supreme Court would have to rule that way and be the first ever court to say that gender-affirming surgery is reproductive health care. But it is a kind of interesting rhetorical tactic that they're using in Missouri to try and tie something that seems to be popular, which is this abortion rights amendment, to something that we know is unpopular in Missouri, which is gender-affirming care, in a way that they're trying to drag down the amendment in various ways.
I think we'll take two more. So who?
And sorry, I don't know much about the Nebraska Senator race. That's why I didn't address that one.
Two more. You, sir.
I'm just curious about the State Board of Election, the state of that race, because I've heard from people that depending on how it goes, there could be book bans and all sorts of other things that would enter into the landscape of public education in Kansas. And I just wondered, without absent polling, do you have any feeling for where that landscape is or how people are working with something so down ballot?
Yeah, so we don't have polling, as you mentioned. One thing we have seen in Kansas in last elections for the State Board of Ed is that even when elections kind of favor Republicans, the State Board of Ed still stays pretty moderate, pretty Democrat. I would expect we see a similar thing this year. That being said, there is always this aspect of the nationalization of those local elections where people are talking about these national issues like book bans, et cetera. I do think it's probably not likely that comes down from the state level. It doesn't necessarily mean that the State Board of Ed would prevent local schools from implementing those, but I don't foresee it being a major issue after the election.
And then, who wants to be last? Last question. You, sir.
Yeah, my question is, hopefully I can get this out right. If Kansas, in fact, had a system where independents could vote in primaries, what do you think the sort of breakdowns that you noted for Johnson County, the Democratic side versus the Republican side, what sort of shift would you see independents being, how would you see those percentages playing out, if that makes any sense?
Well, I can just, Alex, if you want to answer it, just to lay the ground here. So this is just the Johnson County number, but for August 2024, unaffiliated voters in Johnson County, 25%. Now, I assume not all of them would turn out, in an open primary, but presumably some of them would. How would that affect things?
Yeah, so we know there's tons of political science literature that talks about this kind of myth of the independent voter, where 40% of people will tell you they're an independent, but really only about 10% or less of them are. And in Kansas in particular, where it is extremely unpopular to be a Democrat, I think it would certainly benefit Democratic candidates with those voters who, don't want to label themselves as a Democrat, but maybe lean that way. And we would just see, more voter turnout in general, which, depending on the year, depending on kind of what's on the ballot, could either result in, more moderate Republicans or Democrats, right, or, increased turnout in general for, ballot amendments and things that are on those primary ballots. But I think we would certainly see a lot more moderate Republicans.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember, like, the people who vote in primaries, it's like it's a small turnout. It's a really small percentage, and it tends to be more of the people who have really strong opinions about these things who are in real world just kind of political oddballs, right? Like they pay too much attention in some ways. We should go outside and touch grass a little more. There are different methods, I think, that are also trying to get at what you've talked about, and so other states have tried different experiments. Alaska's tried ranked choice voting, and that's been a method. I know Missouri was trying to get that on the ballot last cycle and didn't succeed, and so I think people are noticing that, it does feel like things are getting more and more polarized and scratching their head and wondering, well, whatever happened to that middle ground? And there haven't been any, people I think are also struggling to come up with solid answers for how it might be found.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. I want to thank the Dole Institute for having us and this panel. And just a quick plug, 2 weeks from today, you can come back and I'll moderate a panel, as Audrey mentioned earlier, with Stephanie Sharp and Russell Arbin Fox on the ticket splitting voters. So probably the independent voters will be part of that as well.
And you'll
So
have to come back to see if people will ticket split Trump and Alice.
So thank you all.